Our first intermission this afternoon, Opera News on the Air. Our guest commentator is Father Owen Lee, professor of Greek and Latin classics at St. Michael's College, the University of Toronto. Father Lee will discuss Offenbach and the Tales of Hoffmann and play excerpts from the opera on the Baldwin. Father Lee.
Thank you, Peter Allen. Where does an imaginative artist find his ideas? What made Kafka and Poe think up those weird, wonderful stories? Whatever possessed Hieronymus Bosch when he painted those grotesque canvases? What demon lurked in the imaginations of Murnau and Wiener when they gave us their films Nosferatu and The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari? How, in today's opera, does the poet Hoffmann think up his three tales, each more marvelous than the last? Maybe in Luther's Tavern it's the smoke rising from the meerschaum pipes that inspires Hoffmann, or the beer bubbles singing in the kegs, or the wine in his glass which he empties and fills over and over again. Maybe it's the boy Niklaus who never leaves his side. Or maybe it's that three of the students clamoring for tales are having bad luck with their girls. One says he loves a cold-hearted doll. Another is snared by a brazen courtesan. A third dotes on a virtuoso artist. Hoffmann obliges all three by spinning their suggestions into stories. But what seems most to inspire the stories is that Hoffmann is always unlucky in love himself. It's really his own situation that is refracted into the three distorting mirrors which are his three stories. For Hoffmann is in love with the beautiful Stella, and she has finally agreed to see him that night when she's finished singing in the opera house next door. But her half-imbecile servant, Andres, has sold the letter she wrote to Hoffmann and the key to her room to another, to the sinister counselor Lindorf. And Lindorf is listening in the shadows as Hoffmann tells his tales. That's the situation that is elaborated in the tales Hoffmann tells. Each of them has 6 characters, in effect, the same 6 characters who figure in the situation in the tavern. Hoffmann himself is the protagonist in each story, with Niklaus at his side. But in each tale we also meet Stella, the beautiful woman, and Lindorf, the evil genius, and Luther, the bumbling proprietor, and Andres, the stuttering servant. Only the names are changed. First, Stella. She becomes in turn a doll, a courtesan, and an artist. 3 different grotesques, but all somehow the same elusive figure. As his imagination takes wing, Hoffmann endows each lovely lady with some bird-like quality. The mechanical doll, Olympia, is one of the songbirds in the bower, les oiseaux dans la charmille. And the courtesan Giulietta, intent on snaring Hoffmann, is called L'alouette, the lark. And the artistic Antonia is La Tourterelle, the turtle dove, vulnerable but ever true. Together, the three ladies form a composite picture of Stella, starring next door in Mozart's Don Giovanni, while the tales are being told. Starring in which role, we wonder? There are, after all, three ladies in Don Giovanni. Is Stella playing the soubrette Zerlina, or the avenging Donna Anna, or Elvira, slightly mad but ever true? There is so much for the opera-goer to wonder at as Hoffmann's stories begin to refract the situation in the tavern. Next, Lindorf. The three stories transform this mysterious figure, whom Hoffmann calls a oiseau de malheur, a bird of ill omen, into three villains bent on destroying the poet, Coppelius, Dappertutto, and Dr. Miracle. Each of these figures is at one time or another called Satan, which ought not to surprise us, for the Lindorf who inspires them is, quote, a lover with a satanic streak. One of Hoffmann's first lines is, "The devil take me if ever I fall in love." And that, of course, is what happens 3 times over. Accordingly, Offenbach equips all 4 devils with the same tail-lashing motif. Why is Hoffmann too blind to take effective action against the demons in his stories? Perhaps because all 3 specialize in optical illusions. Coppelius, whose name is from the Italian for eye socket, makes mechanical eyes and magic eyeglasses. Dappertutto, whose name implies that he sees through everything, collects shadows and reflections in mirrors. Dr. Miracle, whose name suggests he can suspend the natural order, treats invisible patients and brings a picture to life. The more we superimpose the 3 tales of Hoffmann one on another, the more correspondences we see. Andres, the practically inarticulate servant in the tavern, reappears in the tales as the stammering assistant Cochineal, the monosyllabic hunchback Pitichinaccio, and the half-deaf butler Franz. And Luther, the hapless tavern keeper, whose wife and wine are the object of so many student jests, he is transmogrified in the tales into the hapless Spallanzani, losing a mechanical daughter, Crespel, losing a real daughter, and Schlemiel, losing his mistress and his life. Are we being too ingenious? Is all this too complex for a libretto by Jules Barbier and Michel Carré, those authors so often maligned for tailoring the mighty texts of Goethe and Shakespeare to suit the sentimental demands of Gounod and Thomas? Well, their Conte d'Hoffmann was originally conceived not as a libretto with music to cover over weaknesses, but as a spoken play to stand or fall on its own merits. In fact, it was staged some 30 years before Offenbach set it to music. It was fashioned, of course, from the works of a real-life storyteller, the famous E.T.A. Hoffmann. But it makes clever changes in the tales it uses. It makes Hoffmann the protagonist in each. It adds Dr. Miracle so that Antonia's story will have a satanic villain to match the one in Olympia's and the one in Giulietta's. It introduces characters from other tales, Cochineal and Pitichinaccio and Franz, so that even the bit parts in the 3 stories will correspond. It eliminates features of the original tales, the spectacular suicide of Olympia's lover, the sinister doings of Antonia's father, because these would not align with the new concept. Barbier and Carré have been censured for softening the horror of the originals, but surely they had something else in mind. They wanted to show how an imaginative artist gets his ideas out of his own experience and how those ideas shape themselves into revealing patterns. Barbier and Carré framed their 3 stories with details from E.T.A. Hoffmann's most famous and most psychobiographical tale, the one he called Don Juan. A traveler wakes in the night to find that his hotel bedroom connects with a private box in an opera house. He wanders into the box. They are doing Don Giovanni below. As he watches, he hears a stirring behind him and turns to see Donna Anna standing there. A kind of telepathic communication passes between them. They kiss. She makes him think he is Don Juan, or is it all a dream? Maybe he is Mozart. In the morning, the traveler wakes in his bed and learns that in the night past, they really were doing Don Giovanni in the opera house next door, and the soprano who sang Donna Anna has died mysteriously in the night. The man who told that tale, the real-life E.T.A. Hoffmann, adored Don Giovanni. To have composed it, he said, would have been the joy of his life. In homage to the man who did compose it, he changed his third name to Amadeus. Now, think of that working in the three stories this afternoon. The opera's Hoffmann stumbles through his stories like a reverse image of Don Giovanni. He equips himself with a companion Leporello, who even sings a snatch of Leporello's music. And he pursues a Zerlina, an Anna, and an Elvira, and in each tale he has to deal with a protective Ottavio and a stammering Mazzetto as well, and a supernatural commendatore always gets him in the end. What a libretto this is. It's small wonder that this libretto appealed to Jacques Offenbach, because he too loved Don Giovanni. It was the music he admired above all. He was proud when Rossini called him the Mozart of the Champs-Élysées, and no doubt stung when Wagner qualified that with a critical, he could have been a Mozart. Popular as he was with operetta, Offenbach desperately wanted in his last years to succeed with an opera. But he was dejected and dying, racing against time as he wrote this one work that could qualify for the title, and he left it incomplete. It survives in a bewildering mass of different editions, with bits here and there by other hands, a not inappropriate end to a work that had Amadeus Mozart spooking around beneath the surface. But more and more of the original opera is now coming to light, and gradually we are discovering that the real resonance in this resonating work was added not by the librettists, but by the composer, when he wrote the part of Niklaus for female voice. Such trouser roles are, of course, a convention in opera. In French opera alone we have familiar examples in Cybele, Stephano, Frédéric, Jean, Ignold, Urbain, and Ascagna. But Niklaus is more complex than any of these. Is he flesh or fantasy? He seems real enough in the prologue and the epilogue in the tavern, but in the three tales he is curiously ignored by everyone except Hoffmann himself. He seems hardly to exist, except as some projection of Hoffmann, some other side of him. In the tales, Niklaus has the perspicacity, the wit, the instinct for survival that the blinded, self-destructive Hoffmann utterly lacks. In Act 1, he sees that Hoffmann is in love with an illusion. In Act 2, he provides the means for Hoffmann to escape from the police. In Act 3, when Crespel draws a knife, he saves Hoffmann from death itself. So we are astonished when, after the tales are told, Niklaus seems to betray his Hoffmann and gives Stella away to Lindorf. What is this Niklaus? Is he Hoffmann's lover? And is this the explanation of the poet's curiously unsuccessful relationships with women? Or is he Hoffmann's Jungian anima, the feminine principle within the man, the source of his creativity, but a potential threat to his psychological development? Or is he Hoffmann's muse, urging him into the pathetic situation in the tavern, prompting him to elaborate it in three tales, and then denying him the personal fulfillment that would still his creative instinct? Recent productions of the opera have restored the ending, which actually turns Niklaus into Hoffmann's muse. He sings, "And I, your faithful friend, whose hand has dried your eyes, I who sent your sorrows wafting upwards in dreams, am I nothing? I love you, Hoffmann, be mine." Anima, lover, inspiring muse, Niklaus may be all of these, but the considerations are only possible because Offenbach wrote the role for a woman to sing. If this is Offenbach's luckiest stroke, there are still 100 other felicitous touches he added with his music. I love the marvelously evocative student choruses. The curious mechanical minuet at Spallanzani's. The electrifying moment when the Venetian characters begin to speak and to kill over the rocking, mocking strains of the barcarolle. The poignant lyricism of Antonia's duet with Hoffmann. And above all, the tension of the trio when Antonia's dead mother comes alive in the picture on the wall. Now, what would you think if I told you that Offenbach originally wrote that suspenseful music not for the appearance of the ghost of Antonia's mother, but for an operetta called Fantasio, and that the sinister theme of Dr. Miracle in Act 3 was first heard 20 years earlier in an Offenbach ballet called Les Papillons, and that Dappertutto's Diamond aria in Act 2 was fashioned by an unknown hand from an overture Offenbach wrote for a piece called A Journey on the Moon for Monte Carlo. As for the big ensemble in that act, the famous septet, we have no idea at all who might have written it. Like the Diamond aria, the septet became a part of the opera only after some imaginative reconstruction in Berlin in 1905. And would you believe that the part of Hoffmann was originally written for baritone, and all 4 female roles for lyric soprano, and that the proposed order of scenes was not Olympia, Giulietta, Antonia, as we have it today, but the Giulietta's scene was to come last, and she was to die at the end of it, as the other ladies do. And most astonishing of all, would you believe that the best-known number in the score, the barcarolle, was first composed to conjure up not Venice's canals, but the Rhine maidens? Yes, Offenbach first penned it for a failed opera called Die Rheinnixen. All of this and much more is true. In his Race Against Time, a race he eventually lost, Offenbach borrowed extensively from previous work, leaving the act he hoped he would be his masterpiece, the Venice Act, in so many versions that it was cut completely from the first run of performances. Some of Hoffmann was finished after Offenbach's death by the man who wrote the recitatives for Carmen, Ernst Guiraud. And the day after the German premiere, Guiraud's original scores were lost to a fire in Vienna's Ringtheater, while 5 years later a second fire at the Opera Comique destroyed much of the Paris materials. It is almost as if, like Hoffmann in the opera, or like the dying Amadeus Mozart, Offenbach, attempting greatness in his last days, was beset by some evil genius. Small wonder that at his funeral the organist used bits of Hoffmann for the Dies Irae and the Agnus Dei. Since then, the original publisher, Schoudens, has issued a series of editions with different materials and alternate endings. To some, the opera seemed only an interesting collection of set pieces, until Hans Gregor at Berlin's Kurfürstenoper in 1905 and Walter Felsenstein at East Berlin's Komische Oper in 1958 went back to the original play for continuity and adapted Offenbach's music for their own ingenious purposes. The gradual emergence of more and more of the original Hoffmann in recent years is something of a detective story, with the last chapter still missing. A remarkable discovery was made about a decade ago by the conductor Antonio de Almeida, who is at present cataloging the chaos in the Offenbach canon, as Kirschel once did for Mozart. So musicologists who refer to the Marriage of Figaro as K492 may soon be citing Les Contes d'Hoffmann as A554. Almeida was searching through a collection of Offenbachiana in a villa near Paris and found a black folder that contained hundreds of pages of the opera in piano vocal parts. It was an early version of the score, as Offenbach had performed it one day at the piano with the assistance of his 4 daughters and some friends, for 2 rival producers interested in staging the piece. Almeida communicated these pages to Fritz Oeser, who was then preparing what was hoped would be the opera's urtext. These and other recent findings pretty well confirmed what we have always suspected about Niklaus, that he was intended from the start to be an embodiment of Hoffmann's muse. The new discoveries provide the boy with more music to sing in each act. In fact, when the Oeser edition was first performed at Cologne in 1980, Niklaus had the second longest role in the opera. But in many ways, Oeser has proved just as controversial with his new Hoffmann as he was with his new Carmen 2 decades ago. Opera houses hesitate to restore music Offenbach himself may have decided to cut, or to include music that Oeser himself presumed to write. For today's broadcast, the Metropolitan is opting for the familiar Schoudens version, with the important difference that in Act 3, Niklaus will take up a violin and sing a romanza to art and music. And even if you have heard Hoffmann on all of its past broadcasts from the Met since 1937, you will not have heard this remarkable piece until today. I think it is a harbinger of things to come. In the future, anything can happen. Only last month, a libretto turned up in Paris with a wholly new ending for the Venice Act. Recently in Salzburg, James Levine prepared a new Hoffmann to mark the Offenbach centenary. And currently in Washington, Michael Kay is completing an edition based on 350 pages of previously unpublished autograph manuscripts. And those new pages are not piano vocal parts, but fully orchestrated. Don't be surprised, then, if in future the Hoffmann you hear has much more dialogue spoken over music, and Act 1 has a new trio, and Act 2 a new gambling scene, and Act 3 ends with our 6 characters and the chorus singing an ensemble that sounds like this. has left Les Contes d'Hoffmann in bits and pieces, like Olympia. Editors may continue to find that it ultimately eludes them, like Giulietta. But frail as it is an opera that really sings like Antonia. It's a wonderful piece that reflects 6 characters in the spirit of Pirandello and conjures up associations of Dr. Jekyll and Dr. Mabuse, Dr. Frankenstein and Dr. Caligari. In one form or another, it has held the stage for over 100 years. The reason for this, I think, is not hard to find. We are all of us fascinated with the imagination and what it can do. And Offenbach and his librettists really do show how the fanciful figures of a creative artist emerge out of the imagination. In this case, out of the Mozart-loving doppelganger imagination of that master teller of tales, E.T. Amadeus Hoffmann himself.
Thank you, Father Owen Lee.